Chapter 1 Historical Background. The British came to India in 1600 as traders in the form of East India Company, which had the exclusive right of trading in India under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I. In 1765, the company, which till now had purely trading functions, obtained the Diwani, that is, rights over revenue and civil justice of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This started its career as a territorial power. In 1858, in the wake of the Sepoy Mutiny, the British Crown assumed direct responsibility for the governance of India. This role continued until India was granted independence on August 15, 1947. With independence came the need of a constitution. As suggested by M.N. Roy, a pioneer of communist movement in India, in 1934, a constituent assembly was formed for this purpose in 1946, and on January 26, 1950, the constitution came into being. However, various features of this Indian constitution and polity have their roots in the British rule. There are certain events in the British rule that laid down the legal framework for the organization and functioning of government and administration in British India. These events have greatly influenced our constitution and polity. They are explained here in a chronological order. The Company Rule 1773 to 1858. Regulating Act of 1773. This act is of great constitutional importance as it was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company in India. It recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company, and it laid the foundations of the central administration in India. Features of this act. It designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal and created an executive council of 4 members to assist him. The first such Governor General was Lord Warren Hastings. It made the governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. Unlike earlier, when the 3 presidencies were independent of one another. 3. It provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court at Calcutta 1774, comprising 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. 4. It prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. 5. It strengthened the control of the British government over the company by requiring the Court of Directors, a governing body of the company, to report on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Pitt's India Act of 1784. In a bid to rectify the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773, the British Parliament passed the Amending Act of 1781, also known as the Act of Settlement. The next important act was the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Features of the Act. It distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company. It allowed the Court of Directors to manage the commercial affairs but created a new body called Board of Control to manage the political affairs. Thus, it established a system of double government. It empowered the Board of Control to supervise and direct all operations of the civil and military government or revenues of the British possessions in India. Thus, the Act was significant for two reasons. First, the company's territories in India were for the first time called the British possessions in India, and second, the British government was given the supreme control over company's affairs and its administration in India. Charter Act of 1833. This act was the final step towards centralization in British India. Features of the Act. First, it made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. Thus, the Act created for the first time a government of India having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India. 2. It deprived the governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor General of India was given exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. The laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while the laws made under this act were called as acts. It ended the activities of the East India Company as a commercial body, which became a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in trust for His Majesty, his heirs, and successors. The Charter Act of 1833 attempted to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants and stated that the Indians should not be debarred from holding any place, office, and employment under the company. However, this provision was negated after opposition from the Court of Directors. Charter Act of 1853. This was the last of the series of Charter Acts passed by the British Parliament between 1793 and 1853. It was a significant constitutional landmark. Features of the Act. It separated for the first time, the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. It provided for addition of 6 new members called legislative councillors to the council. In other words, it established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as the Indian Central Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functioned as a mini parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. Thus, legislation for the first time was treated as a special function of the government, requiring special machinery and special processes. 2. It introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The covenanted civil service was thus thrown open to the Indians also. Accordingly, the Macaulay Committee, the Committee on the Indian Civil Service, was appointed in 1854. 3. It intended the company's rule and allowed it to retain the possession of Indian territories on trust for the British Crown. But it did not specify any particular period. Unlike the previous charters, this was a clear indication that the company's rule could be terminated any time the parliament liked. 4. It introduced for the first time local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. Of the 6 new legislative members of the Governor General's Council, 4 members were appointed by the local provincial governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal, and Agra. The Crown Rule, 1858 to 1947. Government of India Act of 1858. This significant act was enacted in the wake of the revolt of 1857, also known as the First War of Independence or the Sepoy Mutiny. The act, known as the Act for the Good Government of India, abolished the East India Company and transferred the powers of government, territories, and revenues to the British Crown. Features of the Act. It provided that India henceforth was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty. It changed the designation of the Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. He, Viceroy, was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Canning thus became the first Viceroy of India. It ended the system of double government by abolishing the Board of Control and Court of Directors. It created a new office, Secretary of State for India, vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet and was responsible ultimately to the British Parliament. It established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India. The Council was an advisory body. The Secretary of State was made the chairman of the Council. It constituted the Secretary of State in Council as a body corporate capable of suing and being sued in India and in England. The Act of 1858 was, however, largely confined to the improvement of the administrative machinery by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It did not alter in any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India. Indian Councils Act of 1861, 1892 and 1909. After the Great Revolt of 1857, the British government felt the necessity of seeking the cooperation of the Indians in the administration of their country. In pursuance of this policy of association, three acts were enacted by the British Parliament in 1861, 1892 and 1909. The Indian Council Act of 1861 is an important landmark in the constitutional and political history of India. Features of the Act of 1861. It made a beginning of representative institutions by associating Indians with the law-making process. It has provided that the Viceroy should nominate some Indians as non-official members of his expanded council. In 1862, Lord Canning, the then Viceroy, nominated three Indians to his legislative council: the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. It initiated the process of decentralization by restoring the legislative powers of the Bombay and Madras presidencies. It has reversed the centralizing tendency that started from the Regulating Act of 1773 and reached its climax under the Charter Act of 1833. This policy of legislative devolution resulted in the grant of almost complete internal autonomy to the provinces in 1937. It also provided for the establishment of new legislative councils for Bengal, Northwestern Frontier Province, NWFP, and Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1866, and 1897 respectively. It empowered the Viceroy to make rules and orders for the more convenient transaction of business in the Council. It also gave a recognition to the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. Under this, a member of the Viceroy's Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government and was authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the Council on matters of his department. It empowered the Viceroy to issue ordinances without the concurrence of the Legislative Council during an emergency. The life of such an ordinance was 6 months. Features of the Act of 1892. It increased the number of additional or non-official members in the central and provincial legislative councils but maintained the official majority in them. It increased the functions of legislative councils and gave them the power of discussing the budget and addressing questions to the executive. It provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the Central Legislative Council by the Viceroy on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and that of the Provincial Legislative Councils by the governors on the recommendation of the district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars, and chambers. The Act made a limited and indirect provision for the use of election in filling up some of the non-official seats both in the central and provincial legislative councils. The word election was, however, not used in the Act. The process was described as nomination made on the recommendation of certain bodies. Features of the Act of 1909. This Act is also known as Morley-Minto Reforms. Lord Morley was then Secretary of State for India and Lord Minto was then Viceroy of India. It considerably increased the size of the legislative councils, both central and provincial. The number of the members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60. The number of members in the Provincial Legislative Councils was not uniform. It retained officials' majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the Provincial Legislative Councils to have non-official majority. It enlarged the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both the levels. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. It provided for the first time for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member. It introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. Thus, the Act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. It also provided for the separate representation of presidency corporations, chambers of commerce, universities, and zamindars. Government of India Act of 1919. On August 20, 1917, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. The Government of India Act of 1919 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. This act is also known as Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of State for India and Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. Features of the Act. It relaxed the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provincial subjects. The central and provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and unitary. It further divided the provincial subjects into two parts, transferred and reserved. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the legislative council. The reserved subjects, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governors and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. This dual scheme of governance was known as diarchy, a term derived from the Greek word diarche, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. It introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house or council of state and a lower house or legislative assembly. The majority of members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. It required that the three of the six members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, other than the Commander in Chief, were to be Indian. It extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, and education. It created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India. It provided for the establishment of Public Service Commission, hence a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. It separated for the first time provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. It provided for the appointment of a statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. Simon Commission. In November 1927 itself, that is 2 years before the schedule, the British government announced